They say blood is thicker than water, but apparently, it's not thicker than a second marriage certificate. For 70 years, I thought I understood what family meant. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And it took my own birthday party, the one I'd been looking forward to for months, to show me exactly where I stood in my children's lives. What they didn't know was that I held more cards than they could ever imagine. Cards that could change everything they thought they knew about their perfect little world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special. For you, the morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of my bedroom in Riverside, California, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors I'd polished myself just yesterday. 70 years old today. 7 decades of life, love, loss, and everything in between. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the framed photograph on my nightstand. A picture of my 3 children from 20 years ago, back when their smiles were genuine and their hugs lasted more than 2 seconds. Marcus, my eldest, at 45 had inherited his father's sharp jawline and my stubborn streak. He'd always been the responsible one, the one who called every Sunday without fail. At least he used to. Then there was Rebecca, 42, with her mother's eyes and her father's business sense. She'd been Daddy's little girl until the day he died, and somehow I'd never quite filled that void for her. And finally, David, my baby at 38, though he'd probably cringe to hear me call him that. He'd always been the artistic one, the dreamer, the one who needed just a little more help getting on his feet. But that was before Patricia. Patricia Whitmore had waltzed into our lives 3 years ago like she owned the place. At 55, she was 15 years younger than me, with platinum blonde hair that definitely came from a bottle and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She'd met my late husband Richard at some charity function 2 months before he passed. And somehow, in those final weeks of his battle with cancer, she'd managed to position herself as his devoted companion. The wedding had been small, intimate. Richard had insisted on that. "Just family," he'd said, his voice weak but determined. I'd watched from the front row of the hospital chapel as they exchanged vows, my heart breaking, not because I was jealous. Richard and I had been divorced for 15 years by then, but because I could see what she was, what she wanted. And I knew my children couldn't see it yet. Richard had built Morrison Industries from the ground up, starting with a small construction company in the garage of our first home. I'd been there for every late night, every missed dinner, every celebration, and every setback. When the kids were small, I'd managed the books while bouncing David on my hip and helping Marcus with his homework. I'd answered phones between driving Rebecca to piano lessons and making sure there was always coffee brewing for the workers who came by the house for meetings. But here's what nobody knew, what I'd kept secret for over 2 decades. When Richard and I divorced, I hadn't just walked away with half of everything. I'd walked away with 60% ownership of Morrison Industries. Richard had insisted on it, said it was only fair considering how much I'd contributed to building the company. The paperwork was ironclad, witnessed, and filed away in my safe. Deposit box at First National Bank. "Eleanor," Richard had said during our divorce proceedings, his voice heavy with regret, "you built this company as much as I did, maybe more. You deserve the majority stake." I'd protested, of course. I didn't want his guilt money. Didn't want him to feel like he owed me. But he'd been adamant, and his lawyer had backed him up. "It's not guilt, Ellie. It's justice." So I'd taken it, but I'd also made a promise to myself. I wouldn't interfere. I'd let Richard run the company as if it were entirely his, make all the decisions, take all the credit. I'd be a silent partner, collecting my dividends but staying out of the day-to-day operations. It was better that way, cleaner. The kids didn't need to know their parents' business arrangements, and Richard could maintain his pride. After the divorce, I'd focused on rebuilding my life. I'd gone back to school, earned my real estate license, and started my own small but successful agency. The dividends from Morrison Industries had helped, sure, but I'd made my own way too. I'd bought this house in Riverside, a modest 3-bedroom with a garden where I could grow my tomatoes and roses. I'd traveled when I wanted to, spoiled my grandchildren when they came to visit, and lived quietly. The children had all gone to work for Morrison Industries after college, of course. It was expected, the family business and all that. Marcus had worked his way up to vice president of operations. Rebecca was the chief financial officer, and David managed the creative side of their marketing department. They'd earned their positions. I'd made sure Richard understood that nepotism wouldn't fly, not on my watch. But they'd also grown comfortable, secure in the knowledge that they were working for Dad's company, that their futures were guaranteed. What they didn't know was that technically they were working for me. When Richard remarried Patricia, I'd watched from a distance as she slowly but systematically inserted herself into every aspect of his life. She'd redecorated his house, our old house, until nothing of our shared history remained. She'd started attending company functions, playing the role of the supportive wife to perfection. And gradually I'd noticed the changes in my children. The Sunday phone calls became every other Sunday, then monthly, then only when they needed something. The holiday invitations started coming with subtle suggestions that maybe it would be less awkward if I celebrated separately. Family photos began to feature Patricia prominently, while I was either absent or relegated to the background. "She's really trying, Mom," Rebecca had said during one of our increasingly rare coffee dates. "Patricia's been so good to Dad, and she's genuinely interested in getting to know us better. Maybe if you made more of an effort?" An effort. As if I hadn't spent the last 3 years watching this woman systematically erase me from my own family. The final straw had come 6 months ago. David had been having financial troubles. His artistic pursuits weren't exactly lucrative, and his wife Sarah was pregnant with their second child. He'd needed help with the down payment on a larger house, something I would have gladly provided. But when I'd offered, he'd looked uncomfortable. "Actually, Mom, Patricia already offered to help. She said it would be easier to keep it in the family business, you know. She's arranging for a company loan at a really good rate." A company loan. From my company, using my money, while I sat in my living room being told it was easier to go through Patricia. That night, I'd pulled out the documents from my safe deposit box and read through them again, making sure I understood exactly what I owned, exactly what power I held. Morrison Industries was worth approximately $47 million now, according to the latest financial reports that came to me quarterly. 60% of $47 million. The math was simple, even if the emotions weren't. I'd built an empire alongside my ex-husband, raised 3 children who worked for that empire, and somehow become a stranger in my own family story. But I wasn't powerless. Far from it. I just hadn't chosen to exercise that power yet. As I sat on my bed on this 70th birthday morning, looking at that old photograph, I made a decision. Today would be different. Today, I would see exactly where I stood with my children, and then I would decide what to do with the information I'd been sitting on for 20 years. I dressed carefully for my birthday lunch, a navy blue dress that I'd bought specifically for the occasion, pearl earrings that had been my mother's, and the diamond watch Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. I looked like what I was, a woman who had lived, loved, lost, and survived. A woman with stories to tell, and apparently lessons still to learn. The restaurant was Giuseppe's, a family-owned Italian place where Richard and I used to take the kids for special occasions. I'd suggested it, and Marcus had agreed readily. Enough. "Of course, Mom. Giuseppe's it is. We'll see you at noon." I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always did, and was shown to a large round table in the back corner. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes, had decorated the table with a small bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers, though I wondered if my children remembered that. At exactly 12 o'clock, I saw them walk in. Marcus in his expensive suit, his wife Jennifer beside him looking polished and professional. Rebecca with her husband Tom, both of them checking their phones even as they navigated between tables. David and Sarah, she with her hand resting on her growing belly, he with paint stains on his fingers that he'd obviously tried to scrub off. And behind them, like a queen holding court, came Patricia. She'd dressed for the occasion in a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in 6 months. Her jewelry caught the light as she moved, and her smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to maintain her dignity. What struck me most wasn't that she was there. I'd expected that, even hoped for it in a way. What struck me was how my children orbited around her as they approached the table, seeking her approval, waiting for her cues. It was subtle, but unmistakable, once you knew to look for it. "Happy birthday, Mom," Marcus said, leaning down to give me a brief hug. His cologne was expensive, unfamiliar. When had he started wearing cologne? 70 years young, Rebecca added, her kiss landing somewhere near my cheek without actually making contact. "You look wonderful." David's hug lasted a fraction longer than the others, and I caught a whiff of his familiar scent, paint and coffee, and the coconut shampoo he'd used since college. "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry we're right on time instead of early. Traffic was crazy." But it was Patricia who commanded the moment. She stepped forward with a gift bag that was clearly expensive, the kind of bag that cost $20 before you even put anything in it. "Eleanor," she said, her voice pitched perfectly between warmth and respect. "Happy birthday, dear. I hope you don't mind that I tagged along. The family was so sweet to include me." The family, as if she'd been voted in rather than inserting herself. I smiled and accepted the gift bag, noting how my children watched Patricia's face for approval as I opened it. Inside was a silk scarf, beautiful and expensive, in colors that would look stunning on Patricia but had never been colors I wore. "It's lovely," I said, because it was. "Thank you, Patricia." And so began what would become the most illuminating and heartbreaking lunch of my 70 years on this earth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The waiter approached our table with the enthusiasm of someone who recognized a celebration when he saw one. His name tag read, Miguel, and he had the kind of genuine smile that made you feel like you were the most important customer in the restaurant. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I understand we're celebrating a very special birthday today?" His eyes found mine expectantly. Before I could respond, Patricia leaned forward with that practiced charm of hers. "Yes, we're celebrating Eleanor's 70th. Isn't that wonderful? Such a milestone." The way she said it made 70 sound ancient, like I should be grateful just to be upright and breathing. Miguel, bless him, didn't seem to catch the subtle condescension. "Magnificent. 70 years of wisdom and experience. You must have some incredible stories, Senora." "Oh, she does," Marcus interjected, but his tone carried an odd note. Almost dismissive, as if my stories were quaint relics rather than lived experiences. Mom's full of stories about the old days. The old days. When had my life become the old days to my own son? Patricia smiled that perfect smile and began orchestrating the conversation like a conductor leading an orchestra. "Miguel, we'll need a few minutes to look at the menu, but perhaps you could recommend some of your lighter options. Eleanor might prefer something that's easy on the digestion." Easy on the digestion. I'd eaten spicy Thai food just last week and enjoyed every bite, but apparently Patricia had decided I needed to be managed like an invalid. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying more edge than I'd intended, "I'll have the veal marsala. It's what I always order here." A brief silence fell over the table. Jennifer looked uncomfortable. Tom was studying his phone with sudden intensity, and Sarah was fidgeting with her napkin. But it was the look that passed between Patricia and Rebecca that really caught my attention. a split-second exchange that spoke volumes about conversations I hadn't been part of. "Of course, Mom," Rebecca said quickly. "Whatever you'd like. It's your day." But the damage was done. The tone was set. I was the elderly mother being humored, not the matriarch being celebrated. As we settled into ordering, I noticed how the conversation flowed around me rather than through me. Patricia asked Jennifer about her new position at the marketing firm, complimented Tom on his recent promotion, and listened with rapt attention as Sarah described her pregnancy symptoms. She was performing the role of interested family member, with Oscar-worthy skill. Meanwhile, my own children seemed to have forgotten I was there. "The company's been doing incredibly well this quarter," Marcus was saying to Patricia, his voice carrying the pride of someone reporting to a superior. "The Henderson project came in under budget and ahead of schedule." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Your father would be so proud. He always said Morrison Industries was built on good people doing excellent work. Your father, not Richard or my husband. Your father, as if she'd given birth to these 3 adults sitting around our table. What about the Phoenix expansion?" Rebecca asked, leaning forward with obvious excitement. "Patricia, you mentioned last week that you'd been reviewing the proposals?" "Oh, yes." Patricia waved a perfectly manicured hand. "I've been working closely with the board to evaluate our options. There are some very promising opportunities, but we need to be strategic about our growth. Our, as if she'd been part of Morrison Industries from the beginning, instead of for less than 3 years. I took a sip of my water and kept my expression neutral, but inside, something cold was crystallizing. These weren't just casual comments. This was Patricia positioning herself as the company's decision-maker while my children hung on her every word. "Mom," David said suddenly, and for a moment I thought he was going to include me in the business discussion. "Patricia's been helping us look at some new marketing strategies. She has such great insights into brand positioning." "Does she?" I asked mildly. "Oh, it's nothing formal," Patricia said with false modesty. "I just enjoy being involved with what matters to the family. Richard always valued my input, and I hope I can continue to be helpful." Helpful. The word sat in my mouth like something bitter. The food arrived, and with it came a brief respite from the performance. Miguel had remembered that I liked extra Parmesan on my veal, and he made a small ceremony of grating fresh cheese tableside. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt like the first genuine acknowledgement I'd received since arriving. "Delicious choice, Senora," he said with a wink. "The chef will be pleased you ordered his specialty." "Thank you, Miguel. It's perfect." As we ate, the conversation drifted to family updates. Jennifer talked about their son's soccer season. Tom mentioned a fishing trip he was planning, and Sarah shared her hopes for the new baby. Normal family conversation, the kind I'd been part of 1,000 times before, except I wasn't part of it. Not really. I was included in the way you include an elderly aunt at family gatherings, politely, dutifully, but without genuine engagement. When I mentioned that I'd been teaching myself to paint watercolors, Patricia smiled and said, "How lovely, Eleanor. Hobbies are so important at your stage of life." At my stage of life. As if I'd graduated to some separate category of human existence where my interests could only be classified as hobbies rather than genuine pursuits. When I talked about the garden I was planning for next spring, Marcus nodded absently and said, "That's nice, Mom. Just don't overdo it. Maybe hire someone to help with the heavy work." Don't overdo it. The woman who had once managed a household, raised 3 children, and helped build a multi-million-dollar company was now being cautioned against planting tomatoes, but it was Rebecca's comment that cut the deepest. I'd mentioned casually that I was considering taking a trip to Italy in the fall, something I'd been dreaming about since Richard and I had canceled our planned anniversary trip 30 years ago due to a business crisis. "Italy?" Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. "Mom, are you sure that's wise? I mean, traveling alone at your age." maybe you should think about something closer to home. Patricia and I were just talking about how there are some lovely senior tour groups that do day trips to wine country. Senior tour groups. Day trips. As if I were incapable of navigating an airport or reading a map. Actually, I said, my voice steady despite the frustration building in my chest. I've already spoken with a travel agent. The itinerary looks wonderful. Patricia leaned forward with that concerned expression she'd perfected. Eleanor, I hope you won't think I'm overstepping, but have you considered the practical aspects? The walking, the language barrier, being so far from family if something happened. Because at 70, apparently, I was a medical emergency waiting to occur. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I'm quite capable of taking care of myself. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken thoughts. I could see it in their faces. They thought I was being stubborn, unrealistic, maybe even a little delusional about my capabilities. It was David who broke the tension, bless him. I think Italy sounds amazing, Mom. You should absolutely go. Send us lots of pictures. Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and I caught the look she shot David. Disapproval mixed with something else. Disappointment, maybe, that he'd broken ranks. As the lunch progressed, I began to notice other things. Small things that might have been innocent individually, but formed a pattern when viewed together. When the check arrived, Marcus automatically handed it to Patricia to review, as if she were the family's financial authority. When Rebecca mentioned a work problem, she directed her explanation to Patricia rather than to me, seeking advice from someone who'd never worked in the construction industry. When Jennifer talked about their son's college plans, she asked Patricia for her opinion on schools, despite the fact that I had successfully navigated 3 children through higher education. Was being systematically edited out of my own family's decision-making process. The most telling moment came when Sarah excused herself to use the restroom. As she stood, Patricia immediately jumped up to assist her, asking if she needed help walking, if she was feeling dizzy, if the baby was moving too much. It was a kind gesture, the sort of thing a caring family member would do. Except when I'd been pregnant with David, dealing with severe morning sickness while trying to manage the books for the fledgling company, Patricia would have been nowhere to be found. I'd had my mother-in-law, Richard's mother, who'd made it clear that pregnancy was no excuse for not pulling my weight in the family business. But here was Patricia, playing the devoted stepmother-in-law, earning points for consideration I'd never been shown. When Sarah returned, Patricia had already ordered her a ginger ale and asked the waiter to bring some crackers. For the nausea, dear, I remember how difficult the second trimester can be. Remember. As if she'd ever been pregnant, as if she had children of her own. But my children ate it up. Rebecca smiled approvingly at Patricia's thoughtfulness. Marcus nodded as if this confirmed Patricia's natural maternal instincts. Even David looked grateful that someone was taking such good care of his wife, someone other than his mother, who had successfully carried and delivered 3 healthy babies without anyone hovering over her with ginger ale and crackers. As the lunch wound down, Patricia stood and raised her water glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "To Eleanor, on her 70th birthday. A woman who has lived a full life and raised 3 wonderful children who are now pillars of the Morrison Industries family. Here's to celebrating not just where you've been, Eleanor, but to recognizing that your greatest achievement is the legacy you've created in Marcus, Rebecca, and David." Everyone raised their glasses, smiling and nodding at what sounded like a heartfelt tribute. But I heard what Patricia had really said. Your time is past. Your contribution is complete. And your greatest value now is in stepping aside so the rest of us can take over. As I raised my own glass, I met her eyes across the 8C table. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath all that manufactured warmth. She knew exactly what she was doing, and now, finally, so did I. The drive home from Giuseppe's felt longer than usual, even though the afternoon traffic was light. I kept the radio off, needing the silence to process what had just happened. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my reliable Honda Civic, a car Patricia had once suggested I trade in for something more appropriate for a woman of my age, whatever that meant. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the weight of the lunch had settled into my bones like arthritis before a storm. I sat in the car for a few minutes, looking at the house I'd bought after the divorce. A modest ranch-style home with a front porch where I'd spent countless evenings reading and watching the sunset. It wasn't grand like the house Richard and Patricia shared, but it was mine. Inside, I kicked off my heels and put on my comfortable slippers, the ones with the worn spots that molded perfectly to my feet. The silence of my own home felt different now, not peaceful, but empty. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into my reading chair, but the book I'd been enjoying all week couldn't hold my attention. Instead, I found myself replaying every word, every glance, every subtle power play from the lunch. Patricia's performance had been flawless, but performances were exactly what they were. The question that kept nagging at me was whether my children were willing participants in this theater or if they were as much victims of Patricia's manipulation as I was. 3 days later, that question would be answered in the most unexpected way. I was in my garden, wearing my old gardening clothes and a sun hat that had seen better days, when I heard the familiar sound of Marcus's BMW pulling into my driveway. Through the wooden slats of my fence, I could see him getting out of the car, but he wasn't alone. Patricia emerged from the passenger side, looking impeccable as always in white linen pants and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I brushed the dirt off my hands and walked around to meet them, wondering what could have prompted this unexpected visit. Marcus had that look on his face, the one he'd worn as a child when he'd broken something and was trying to figure out how to tell me about it. "Mom," he called out, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness. That immediately put me on alert. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by. Patricia wanted to see your garden." Patricia wanted to see my garden. In 3 years, Patricia had never expressed the slightest interest in gardening, plants, or anything that involved getting dirt under her fingernails. "Of course," I said, managing a smile. "Come in. I'll make some iced tea." "Oh, don't go to any trouble," Patricia said quickly. "We can't stay long. I just wanted to have a little chat with you. Woman to woman, woman to woman." My internal alarm system started blaring. We settled on my back patio, me in my gardening clothes feeling suddenly underdressed. Patricia perched on the edge of her chair as if she was afraid my cushions might contaminate her expensive outfit. Marcus looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his car keys and checking his phone every few minutes. "Eleanor," Patricia began, her voice taking on that tone people use when they're about to deliver news they think is for your own good. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation at lunch the other day, about your Italy trip. I hadn't mentioned Italy since the lunch. Whatever this was about, it had been percolating in Patricia's mind for 3 days. I'm concerned," she continued. "And I know Marcus is too. Aren't you, Marcus?" Marcus looked up from his phone, clearly caught off guard. Well, we just want to make sure you're safe, Mom." "Safe," I repeated flatly. Patricia leaned forward, her expression the picture of concerned caring. "Darling, you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. You're 70 years old. You'd be traveling alone to a foreign country where you don't speak the language. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? What if you got lost or confused? Got lost or confused, as if my 70th birthday had come with a sudden onset of dementia." "I appreciate your concern," I said, keeping my voice level. "But I'm perfectly capable of—" "Are you, though?" Patricia interrupted gently. "Eleanor, I say this with love, but we've all noticed some changes lately. Changes. My blood pressure spiked, but outwardly I remained calm. What kind of changes? Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Patricia reached over and patted his hand encouragingly, as if he were a child who needed support to speak up to his mother. Well, Marcus said reluctantly, last month when you came to David's house for Emma's birthday party, you seemed confused about where you'd parked your car. I stared at him. I walked around the block for 5 minutes looking for my car because there were so many vehicles parked on the street. That's not confusion, Marcus. That's a crowded neighborhood. And then there was the incident with your neighbor's name, Patricia added smoothly. Mrs. Henderson? You couldn't remember her first name when you were telling us about her hip surgery. Her first name is Gladys, and I've known her for 8 years, I said, my voice getting sharper despite my efforts to stay calm. I had a momentary mental blank. It happens to people of all ages. Patricia and Marcus exchanged one of those looks, the kind that said they thought I was proving their point by getting defensive. Mom, Marcus said, his voice taking on that patient tone you use with stubborn elderly relatives. We're not trying to upset you. We're trying to help. Patricia has some really good ideas about how we can make sure you're comfortable and safe. Ideas. Of course, Patricia had ideas. I've been researching some wonderful senior living communities, Patricia said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what was obviously a prepared presentation. Not nursing homes, goodness no. These are active adult communities with all sorts of amenities. Golf courses, fitness centers, organized activities. You'd have your own apartment, but there would be people around to help if you needed anything. Senior living communities. They wanted to put me in a senior living community. Some of them even have art studios, Patricia continued enthusiastically. Remember how you mentioned taking up watercolors? You could take classes with other people. Your age. Wouldn't that be nice? Other people my age. As if I'd suddenly become incompatible with anyone born after 1950. I set down my iced tea with deliberate care, using the moment to gather my thoughts and control my temper. When I looked up, both Patricia and Marcus were watching me with expressions of expectant concern, waiting for me to gratefully accept their generous offer to manage my life. You want me to sell my house? I said quietly. Well, yes. Eventually, Patricia said. But think about it, Eleanor. This place is getting to be too much for you to maintain. The yard work, the upkeep, being here all alone. Wouldn't it be a relief to let someone else handle all those responsibilities? I have a lawn service for the heavy work, and I enjoy taking care of my garden. But what about emergencies? Marcus chimed in, clearly reading from Patricia's script. What if you fell in the shower? What if you had a heart attack? It could be hours before anyone found you. What if? Their entire argument was based on hypothetical disasters that might never happen. I have a medical alert system, I said. I check in with Mrs. Henderson every day. I have my phone with me at all times. Patricia smiled that patient smile again. Of course you do, dear. But wouldn't it be nice not to have to worry about any of that? To have people around who could help with everything? People around. She made it sound like a party instead of what it really was. Institutionalization, disguised as convenience. And think about the financial benefits, Marcus added, warming to his topic. You could sell this place, use the proceeds to pay for the community, and still have money left over. Patricia found some places that are really reasonable. Reasonable. I wondered if Marcus had any idea what my house was worth, or what my financial situation actually was. Probably not. He'd never asked, and I'd never volunteered the information. I've even made some appointments for us to visit a few places, Patricia said, pulling out a small notebook. There's Sunset Manor, which has a lovely dining room and organized bridge games. Golden Years Gardens has a beautiful courtyard and offers transportation to medical appointments. And Serenity Springs has... Stop. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was past caring about politeness. Patricia blinked, taken aback by my tone. Marcus frowned. Mom, he said, we're trying to help you here. Help me, I repeated. By forcing me out of my home and into an institution because you think I'm too old and incompetent to live independently? That's not what we're saying, Patricia protested, but her voice had lost some of its smoothness. We're thinking about your future, about what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone. There it was, the real truth slipping out from behind. All the concern and caring. Everyone meaning who, exactly? I asked. Marcus and Patricia exchanged another look, and I saw Patricia give him an almost imperceptible nod. Well, Marcus said slowly, there are practical considerations. If something happened to you, if you couldn't take care of yourself, the responsibility would fall on us, on the family. We have our own lives, our own responsibilities. Rebecca's got the new baby coming. David's got his career to think about. I've got the company to run. The company to run. My company, though he didn't know that. And of course, Patricia added smoothly, there's the question of inheritance planning. If you're in a secure facility, we know you're being taken care of, and there's no question about what happens to your assets when the time comes. When the time comes. They were planning my death while discussing my living arrangements. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 70 years in that moment, but not from age or infirmity. From the crushing weight of realizing that my own children saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. I think you should leave now, I said quietly. Mom, please don't be upset, Marcus said, rising from his chair. We're not trying to hurt your feelings. We love you. Do you? I asked. Because love doesn't usually come with brochures for institutions and discussions about inheritance planning. Patricia stood as well, smoothing down her perfect outfit. Eleanor, I understand this is a lot to process. Why don't you take some time to think about it? We don't need an answer right away. How generous of them to give me time to process my own eviction. I don't need time to think about it, I said. The answer is no. This is my home, and I'm staying in it. Marcus sighed, the sound heavy with frustration and what I was beginning to recognize as condescension. Mom, you're being stubborn. We're trying to do what's right for you. What's right for me? Or what's convenient for you? The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Then Patricia stepped forward, and her mask slipped just enough for me to see the steel underneath. Eleanor, she said, her voice still pleasant but with an edge that hadn't been there before. I hope you'll reconsider. It would be such a shame if stubbornness led to complications. Complications. The word was delivered with surgical precision, and we all knew it wasn't about my health or safety. They left without another word, Marcus not even bothering with his usual perfunctory hug. I watched from my front window as Patricia placed her hand on Marcus's arm in the driveway, leaning in close to say something that made him nod grimly. When their car disappeared down the street, I sank into my reading chair and stared at the senior living brochures Patricia had left behind on my coffee table. Sunset Manor, Golden Years Gardens, Serenity Springs. Pretty names for the place where Eleanor Morrison was supposed to disappear quietly, conveniently, and permanently. But Eleanor Morrison had built an empire once. She'd raised 3 children, survived a divorce, and created a life on her own terms, and she wasn't going anywhere without a fight. The phone calls started the next morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing my second cup of coffee and trying to focus on the morning crossword puzzle, when the landline rang. The caller ID showed Rebecca's number. Hi, sweetheart, I answered, hoping for a normal conversation with my daughter. Mom. Rebecca's voice was crisp, businesslike. No greeting, no pleasantries. I just got off the phone with Marcus. He told me about yesterday. Of course he had. I should have expected the coordinated campaign. Did he? I kept my voice neutral. Mom, I'm disappointed. Patricia was trying to help you, and Marcus said you were difficult. Difficult. That was a new one. In 70 years, I'd been called many things, but difficult had never been one of them. I was honest, I said. There's a difference. Rebecca sighed, the sound carrying all the exasperation of a busy woman dealing with an unreasonable parent. Look, I don't have a lot of time. Tom and I are dealing with the pregnancy, work is insane, and now I have to worry about you being stubborn about your living situation. Have to worry. As if my independence was a burden she was being forced to carry. Rebecca, I don't need you to worry about me. I'm fine. Are you, though? The question came out sharp, impatient. Mom, you're 70 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you, making unrealistic plans to travel to Europe by yourself. At some point, you have to be practical. Practical. The same word Patricia had used, delivered with the same tone of barely concealed irritation. I am being practical, I said. I'm living within my means, maintaining my health and making my own decisions. That used to be called being an adult. Don't get sarcastic with me, Mom. This isn't about your pride. It's about reality. What happens when you can't drive anymore? What happens when you can't handle the stairs? What happens when I die? I interrupted. Is that what you really want to know, Rebecca? What happens to the house when I'm gone? Silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, that's not fair, isn't it? Because that seems to be what everyone's most concerned about lately. Another sigh. I have to go, Mom. I have a meeting. Just think about what Marcus and Patricia suggested, okay? Nobody's trying to hurt you. We're trying to help. She hung up before I could respond. 20 minutes later, David called. Hey, Mom. His voice was gentler than Rebecca's, but I could hear the underlying tension. Sarah and I wanted to check in with you. How thoughtful. Look, I know Marcus and Rebecca can be a little intense sometimes, but they mean well. We all do. Do you, David? A pause. Then, of course we do, Mom. You're our mother. We love you. But we're worried. Yesterday, when Marcus told us about your reaction to the senior living idea. Mom, maybe you should at least look at some of these places. Just look. What could it hurt? What could it hurt? My youngest son, the one I'd carried to countless art classes and music lessons, the one I'd supported through 3 different career changes, was asking me what it could hurt to visit my future prison. David, do you remember when you were 25? And you wanted to move to New York to pursue your photography career? Yeah, of course. Do you remember what everyone said? That it was impractical, that you should get a stable job, that you were being unrealistic about your chances of success. Mom, that's not the same thing. Isn't it? Everyone was worried about you too. Everyone wanted you to be practical. Everyone had opinions about what was best for your future. But I was young then. I could afford to take risks. And I'm old now, so I can't? Silence. David, I supported your dreams when everyone else thought you were making a mistake. I believed in your right to make your own choices, even when I was scared for you. All I'm asking for is the same respect. I know, Mom. I know. His voice was softer now, more like the son I remembered. It's just, Patricia makes some good points about safety and, Patricia, I interrupted, has been in this family for 3 years. I've been your mother for 38. Don't you think I've earned the right to have my opinion carry a little more weight than hers? Another pause. Then, Sarah's calling me. I have to go. We'll talk later, okay? He hung up too. I sat staring at the phone for a long time after that, feeling more alone than I had since Richard died. My own children, the babies I'd nursed, the toddlers I'd chased, the teenagers I'd worried about, the young adults I'd supported, were ganging up on me like I was some stranger who'd wandered into their lives and needed to be managed. That afternoon, I decided to take a drive. I needed to get out of the house, away from the phone, away from the senior living brochures that Patricia had left behind like a curse. I found myself driving toward Morrison Industries, the company headquarters that had been built 15 years ago when the business really started to take off. I parked across the street and sat in my car, looking up at the building that represented so much of my life's work. It was a modest 3-story structure, nothing fancy, but solid and well-maintained. The sign out front read, Morrison Industries, Building Quality, since 1982. Richard had insisted on that tagline, said it represented both the company's literal construction work and its commitment to integrity. I wondered if Patricia knew the company's history, if she understood that the Morrison in Morrison Industries wasn't just Richard's name, it was mine too. We'd been married when he started the company. My maiden name was Sullivan, but I'd been Eleanor Morrison for 25 years, through all the years that mattered most. As I sat there, I saw employees leaving for the day. Some faces I recognized from company picnics and Christmas parties, others were new to me. I saw Marcus's car in the executive parking section, and beside it, a silver Mercedes that I didn't recognize but suspected belonged to Patricia. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, I watched Patricia emerge from the building, looking perfectly professional in a tailored business suit. She wasn't just visiting, she was clearly coming from work, from inside my company. Marcus followed her out, and they stood talking in the parking lot for several minutes. Even from a distance, I could see that this wasn't a casual conversation between a stepmother and stepson. This was business. Patricia was gesturing toward the building. Marcus was nodding, taking notes on his phone. Then Rebecca appeared, joining their conversation. The three of them stood there like a board of directors planning the company's future. My company's future. I started my car and drove home, my mind racing. Patricia wasn't just inserting herself into my family, she was inserting herself into Morrison Industries, and my children were letting her do it. That evening, I called my lawyer. James Bradley had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since my divorce. He was a straight-talking man in his 60s who didn't believe in sugarcoating, bad news or overselling good news. Eleanor, he said when his secretary put me through. Good to hear from you. How are you holding up? I've been better, James. I need to ask you about something. Of course. What's on your mind? My ownership stake in Morrison Industries. I want to make sure I understand exactly what that means, what rights it gives me. A pause. Eleanor, is everything all right? You haven't asked about the company details in 20 years. Everything's fine. I just need to refresh my memory about what I can and cannot do as majority shareholder. Well, as we've discussed before, you own 60% of the company. That gives you controlling interest. You have the right to make all major business decisions, hire and fire executives, approve budgets, authorize expenditures over a certain threshold. What about family members who work for the company? What do you mean? Can I fire family members if I have cause? James was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, you can fire anyone for cause, family or not. But I have to ask, what's going on? I told him about Patricia's increasing involvement in the company, about my children's assumption that she had some kind of authority there, about the senior living situation and what felt like a coordinated effort to push me aside. I see, James said, when I finished. That's concerning. Eleanor, have you considered that your children might not fully understand your position with the company? What do you mean? Well, you've been very hands-off for 20 years. They might genuinely believe that Patricia has some legitimate role there, especially if Richard discussed business matters with her before he died. But she has no legal standing, right? None whatsoever. She's not mentioned in any of the corporate documents. She has no ownership stake, no official position, no authority to make decisions or represent the company in any capacity. And if someone were making representations that she did have authority, that would be problematic, potentially very problematic, depending on what kinds of representations were being made and to whom. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. James, I want you to do something for me. Of course. I want you to have someone quietly investigate Patricia's activities at Morrison Industries. I want to know exactly what she's been doing there, what authority she's been claiming, what decisions she's been involved in. Eleanor, are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. That night, I sat in my reading chair with a cup of tea and tried to make sense of everything that had happened in the past week. My 70th birthday lunch, where I'd been treated like a tolerated guest at my own celebration. The visit from Marcus and Patricia, with their senior living brochures and their thinly veiled threats. The phone calls from Rebecca and David, dutifully delivering the message that I needed to be more cooperative. And now the revelation that Patricia was somehow involved in the day-to-day operations of Morrison Industries. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Hello? Helen? It's Eleanor Morrison. Helen Patterson had been Richard's secretary for 30 years, from the early garage days, right up until his death. She'd retired shortly after Richard died, saying the company wouldn't be the same without him. Eleanor, what a lovely surprise. How are you, dear? I'm well, Helen. Listen, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to ask you about something. Of course. What can I help you with? Patricia, Richard's widow. I was wondering, did she spend much time at the office while Richard was still alive? Helen was quiet for a moment. Well, toward the end, yes. Richard was getting sicker, and she started coming in to help with some of his correspondence, that sort of thing. And after he died? That's interesting that you ask. She kept coming in for a while, said she was helping to wrap up his personal affairs. But Eleanor, some of us thought it was odd. Odd how? She was asking a lot of questions about the business, operations, the financial structure, who had decision-making authority. At first, we thought she was just trying to understand Richard's work, for closure. But then she started attending meetings, giving opinions about company direction. Did she ever claim to have any official authority? Not directly. But she had a way of speaking that made people think she did. She'd say things like, Richard would have wanted this, or the family has decided that. People started deferring to her because they assumed she was speaking for the Morrison family. The Morrison family, which, technically, she wasn't part of, even though she'd married into the name. Helen, one more question. Is she still involved with the company? Oh, yes. From what I hear through the grapevine, she's become quite influential. There, some people call her the power behind the throne. The power behind the throne. In my company, I thanked Helen and hung up, then sat staring out my window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Patricia was probably planning her next move in whatever game she was playing. And my children, my own children, were either willing participants or unwitting pawns. But Patricia had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated Eleanor Morrison. And tomorrow, I was going to remind everyone exactly who Eleanor Morrison was. The morning after my conversation with Helen, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fog of confusion and hurt that had been clouding my judgment was gone, replaced by something sharper and more focused. I had spent 3 days being reactive, responding to other people's agendas. Today, I was going to be proactive. I dressed, carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to board meetings back when I was more involved with the business side of my real estate agency. I applied my makeup with extra care and chose the pearl necklace Richard had given me for our 15th anniversary. If I was going to confront Patricia on her own turf, I was going to look like the woman who owned 60% of Morrison Industries. First stop, James Bradley's law office. James's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place that inspired confidence through understated elegance rather than flashy displays of wealth. His secretary, Mrs. Chen, had been with him for 20 years and remembered me from my divorce proceedings. "Mrs. Morrison," she said warmly as I walked in, "Mr. Bradley is expecting you. Can I get you some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." James's office hadn't changed much over the years. Dark wood furniture, law books lining the walls, and a large window that looked out over the courthouse square. He stood up when I entered, gesturing toward the leather chairs in front of his desk. "Eleanor, you look determined this morning." "I am determined, James. Did you have a chance to make those inquiries I asked about?" He opened a file folder on his desk. "I did, and I have to say, what I found is troubling." My stomach tightened. "Tell me." "I had one of my associates contact some vendors and clients of Morrison Industries, just casual conversations to get a sense of how the company is being perceived in the business community." He pulled out a yellow legal pad covered with notes. The past year, Patricia has apparently been representing herself as a company officer in at least 6 different business interactions. She's signed contracts as family representative, she's attended vendor meetings as director of strategic planning, and she's been giving interviews to trade publications as Morrison Industries family spokesperson. My hands clenched in my lap. None of those are real positions. That's correct. More concerning, she's been making commitments on behalf of the company that may exceed your children's actual authority. What kind of commitments? James flipped through several pages. A 3-year exclusive contract with a new supplier that locks the company into pricing that's 15% above current market rates. A partnership agreement with a consulting firm that grants them access to proprietary information. And most concerning, she's been in negotiations with a potential buyer for a minority stake in the company. The room seemed to tilt around me. A buyer? Harrington Development Group. They're looking to acquire a 30% stake in Morrison Industries. The preliminary discussions have been happening for 6 months, and Patricia has been the primary contact. 30%. Combined with her influence over my children's 40%, that would effectively give her control of my company. James, can she legally do any of this? Absolutely not. She has no authority to negotiate contracts, make commitments, or discuss ownership transfers. Every single one of these actions is legally questionable at best and potentially fraudulent at worst. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the scope of what Patricia had been doing. This wasn't just manipulation or social maneuvering. This was theft. She was stealing my company right out from under me while positioning me as too old and incompetent to notice. What are my options? James leaned forward. Several. You could demand that all contracts signed without proper authorization be voided. You could file a lawsuit for misrepresentation and fraud. You could have Patricia banned from company premises and publicly clarify that she has no authority to act on behalf of Morrison Industries. Or you could do what you should have done 20 years ago, take active control of your company. The words hung in the air between us. James was right, and we both knew it. I'd spent 2 decades being a silent partner, allowing Richard to run the company while I collected dividends and stayed out of the way. After his death, I'd continued that pattern, assuming my children would respect the business and the values it was built on. I'd been naive. What would that look like? I asked. You call a board meeting. As majority shareholder, you have the right to do that at any time. You remove any officers who have exceeded their authority or failed in their fiduciary duties. You install new leadership. You make it clear that you are the decision maker, and anyone who wants to challenge that can deal with your lawyers. And my children? James's expression softened. That's the hard part, Eleanor. They work for the company, but they don't own it. If they've been acting outside their authority or enabling someone else to do so, you have every right to address that. Even if it means firing them? even if it means firing them. I left James's office with a thick folder of documentation and a plan. But first, I needed to see for myself exactly what was happening at Morrison Industries. I drove to the company headquarters and parked in the visitors section rather than the executive lot. The building looked the same as it had yesterday, but now I saw it through different eyes. This wasn't just the place where my children worked. This was my company, built with my sweat and sacrifices, and it was being stolen from me. The receptionist in the lobby was new, a young woman I didn't recognize. When I approached her desk, she looked up with a professional smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm Eleanor Morrison. I'd like to see my son Marcus, please." Her smile faltered slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need an appointment. I'm the majority shareholder of this company." The young woman blinked, clearly not sure how to respond to that. Let me call Mr. Morrison's office." I waited while she whispered into her headset, watched her face grow more confused as whoever she was talking to gave her instructions. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Mr. Morrison is in meetings all morning. Perhaps you could schedule something for later in the week?" "What meetings?" I'm not sure I can share that information." I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Dear, I own this company. There is no information here that I'm not entitled to know." Before she could respond, the elevator doors opened and Patricia emerged, looking every inch the corporate executive in a sharp black suit and carrying a leather portfolio. She saw me immediately, and for just a moment, her composed mask slipped, to reveal something that looked like panic. Then the mask was back in place, and she approached with that practiced smile of hers. "Eleanor, what a surprise! What brings you here?" "I came to visit my company," I said pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind." Patricia's laugh sounded forced. "Of course not. Though I have to say this is unexpected. You haven't been here in, what, 5 years? 6 years, I corrected. But I've decided it's time to be more involved." "How wonderful." Patricia's voice was bright, but her eyes were calculating. "I'm sure Marcus and Rebecca would love to give you a tour, show you all the exciting changes we've been making. There it was again. "I'd love that," I said. "In fact, I was hoping to sit in on some meetings, get a sense of the current operations." "Oh." Patricia glanced at the receptionist, then back at me. "Well, today might not be the best day. We have some very technical discussions scheduled, budget reviews and contract negotiations that might be a bit dry for someone who isn't involved in the day-to-day operations." Too dry for someone who isn't involved. In other words, too complicated for the elderly former wife who shouldn't be bothering herself with business matters. "Patricia," I said, my voice still pleasant but with an edge that made the receptionist's eyes widen. "I think you might be confused about my role here." "Oh no, I understand perfectly. You're Richard's ex-wife, and of course you have a special place in the Morrison family. But in terms of the business, I own 60% of this company," I interrupted, loud enough that several employees walking through the lobby turned to look. "Richard was my business partner for 25 years before he was your husband. For 3. There is nothing happening in this building that is too complicated for me to understand." Patricia's face went pale under her perfectly applied makeup. The receptionist looked like she wanted to disappear under her desk. "Eleanor," Patricia said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Perhaps we should. But first, I'd like to see Marcus. Is he in his office?" "Actually, he's in the conference room with some potential investors. It's a very delicate negotiation." "Harrington Development Group?" I asked casually. The color drained completely from Patricia's face. "How did you—" "I know a lot of things, Patricia. More than you might think." I walked past her toward the elevator, leaving her standing in the lobby looking stunned. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor gave me time to compose myself and prepare for what was coming next. Marcus's office was at the end of the hall, but the conference room was closer. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus, Rebecca, and 3 men in expensive suits gathered around a large table covered with documents. At the head of the table, presenting to the group like she was the CEO, was Patricia. I watched for a moment, taking in the scene. Patricia was clearly leading the discussion, pointing to charts and graphs while my children nodded along like subordinates. The 3 men, obviously the potential investors, were directing their questions to her, not to Marcus or Rebecca. I opened the conference room door and walked in. The conversation stopped immediately. Marcus looked up with surprise. Rebecca's mouth actually fell open, and the 3 investors looked confused about who this new person was and why she'd interrupted their meeting. Patricia recovered first, standing up with that forced smile. "Eleanor." "There you are. Gentlemen, this is Eleanor Morrison, Richard's ex-wife." Richard's ex-wife, not the company founder's partner, not the majority shareholder, just the ex-wife. "Actually," I said, addressing the 3 investors directly, "I'm Eleanor Morrison, majority shareholder and founder of Morrison Industries." The room went dead silent. One of the investors, a distinguished man with silver hair, stood up and extended his hand. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm David Harrington from Harrington Development Group. It's a pleasure to meet you." I shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Harrington, I understand you're interested in purchasing a stake in my company." "Yes, we are. We've been working with Mrs." He glanced at Patricia uncertainly. "Patricia has no authority to negotiate on behalf of Morrison Industries," I said calmly. "She's not an officer of the company. She's not on the board of directors. And she has no ownership stake. Any discussions you've had with her regarding the sale of company assets have been unauthorized." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus and Rebecca were staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Patricia looked like she was about to be sick. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. "I see. Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting once the proper authorization has been established." "That would be wise," I agreed. The 3 investors gathered their papers and left, murmuring among themselves as they headed for the elevator. When the conference room door closed behind them, I turned to face my family. "Now," I said, my voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "let's talk about what's been happening in my company." The silence in the conference room stretched, like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that looked dangerously close to anger. Rebecca had her hands pressed flat against the table, staring at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted a second head. And Patricia was calculating. I could see it in her eyes, trying to figure out how to spin this disaster in her favor. "Mom," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "What the hell was that?" I moved to the head of the conference table, the spot where Patricia had been standing moments before, and set down my purse with deliberate care. "That was me preventing you from making a catastrophic business decision." "Catastrophic?" Rebecca stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward. "Mom, you just humiliated us in front of potential investors. Do you have any idea how long we've been working on this deal?" 6 months, I said calmly. "According to my sources, Patricia has been negotiating with Harrington Development for 6 months, without authorization, without legal authority, and without my knowledge or consent." Patricia finally found her voice. "Eleanor, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply facilitating discussions on behalf of the family." "Whose family?" I interrupted. "Because you're not part of the Morrison family that owns this company. Richard was part of that family when he was alive, and he's gone. My children are part of that family, but they work for this company. They don't own it." Marcus slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the glass-walled room. "What is that supposed to mean?" For 20 years, I had protected my children from the complex reality of Morrison Industries' ownership structure. I had let them believe that their father owned the company, that they were heirs to his empire, that their futures were secure because of his success. I had done it out of love, out of a desire to let them find their own way without the pressure of knowing they were working for their mother's company. But that protection had backfired spectacularly. "It means," I said, meeting Marcus's angry stare with a steady gaze, "that when your father and I divorced, I retained majority ownership of Morrison Industries. 60% to be exact." The color drained from Marcus's face. Rebecca sank back into her chair like she'd been punched. Even Patricia looked genuinely shocked. "That's impossible," Rebecca whispered. "Dad built this company. It was his life's work." "Your father and I built this company together," I corrected gently. "For 15 years, while you children were growing up, I was his full partner in every decision, every late night, every risk we took. When we divorced, he insisted that I keep majority ownership because he said it was fair compensation for my contribution." Marcus was shaking his head. No, that can't be right. Dad always talked about passing the company down to us, about our inheritance." "And he could have done that," I said. "The 40% he retained was his to leave to whomever he chose. But he never owned more than 40% after our divorce was finalized." I opened my purse and pulled out copies of the incorporation documents James had prepared for me. "These are the official ownership records, filed with the state and updated annually. Eleanor Morrison, 60%. Richard Morrison, 40%. Upon Richard's death, his shares were distributed equally among his 3 children, giving each of you 13.3% ownership." I set the documents on the table where they could all see them. "Patricia owns 0% of Morrison Industries. She has no legal standing, no authority to make decisions, and no right to negotiate on behalf of this company." Patricia's mask finally slipped completely. Her voice came out harsh, desperate. "You let me believe, Richard let me believe, that I would have a role here after he died. He talked about our future, about building something together. Richard may have talked about a lot of things," I said, my voice growing harder. "But he couldn't give you what he didn't own, and he certainly couldn't authorize you to sell shares. That belonged to me." Marcus stood up slowly, like an old man despite being only 45. "How long have you known? About the Harrington deal, about Patricia's involvement?" "I found out yesterday." Which raises the question, how long have you known that Patricia was representing herself as having authority she doesn't possess? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Because that's what it was. Rebecca spoke first, her voice small and defensive. "We thought Patricia said she'd been working with Dad on business decisions before he died. She seemed to know so much about the company, about the industry. When she offered to help with vendor negotiations and client relations, it seemed natural. Natural to let someone with no legal authority sign contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars? She never signed anything major without our approval," Marcus said quickly. "We reviewed everything. Did you review the exclusive supplier contract with Davidson Materials? The one that locks us into above-market pricing for 3 years?" Marcus blinked. "What contract?" I pulled out another document from my purse. "This one? Signed last month by Patricia as Director of Strategic Planning. A position that doesn't exist, authorizing an agreement that will cost this company approximately $200,000 over the contract term." Rebecca grabbed the document, scanning it frantically. "I never saw this. Marcus, did you approve this?" "No. I've never seen this contract before in my life." All 3 of us turned to look at Patricia, who had gone very still in her chair. "Patricia?" I said quietly. "Would you like to explain this contract?" She lifted her chin with the defiance of someone who had been backed into a corner but wasn't ready to surrender. "Davidson Materials offered us better terms than our current supplier. I saw an opportunity to save the company money." "You saw?" "An opportunity to accept a kickback," I interrupted. James Bradley's investigation found that Davidson Materials has been paying consulting fees to a company called Whitmore Strategic Solutions. Your company, Patricia. The accusation hit the room like a bomb. Marcus's face went white, Rebecca gasped audibly, and Patricia's defiant expression crumbled. That's not. I was providing legitimate consulting services to a company you then awarded a contract with Morrison Industries. That's called a conflict of interest, Patricia. In some states, it's called fraud. Marcus sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. Jesus Christ. Patricia, what have you done? I was trying to help. Patricia's voice rose to nearly a shout. This company was drifting after Richard died. Nobody was making strategic decisions. Nobody was looking at the big picture. You and Rebecca were so focused on day-to-day operations that you couldn't see the opportunities. Opportunities to steal from us? Rebecca's voice was ice cold. I wasn't stealing. Every decision I made was in the best interest of Morrison Industries. The best interest of Morrison Industries, I said, standing up and walking around the table until I was directly in front of Patricia, is determined by the person who owns 60% of Morrison Industries. That person is me, not you. Patricia looked up at me with something that might have been hatred. You abandoned this company 20 years ago. You walked away and collected your dividend checks while other people did the actual work. You have no idea what it takes to run a business in today's market. Don't I? I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Patricia, before I married Richard, I had a degree in business administration and 5 years of experience in corporate finance. After our divorce, I built my own real estate agency from scratch and grew it into one of the most successful firms in the county. I may be 70 years old, but I'm not the doddering old fool you've been painting me as. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. What I am is a woman who has been watching you systematically steal my company while manipulating my children into thinking I'm too old and incompetent to notice. That ends today. Marcus looked up from his hands. Mom, what are you going to do? It was a good question. I had several options and none of them were easy. I could have Patricia arrested for fraud and theft. I could fire my children for allowing this to happen under their watch. I could clean house completely and start over with new management. Or I could do what I should have done 20 years ago. I'm taking control of my company, I said simply. Effective immediately, I'm assuming the position of Chief Executive Officer of Morrison Industries. The words seemed to echo in the quiet room. Rebecca made a small, wounded sound. Marcus just stared at me. As my first official act, I continued, Patricia Whitmore is banned from these premises. She is not to return. She is not to contact clients or vendors on behalf of Morrison Industries, and any contracts she signed without proper authorization are under immediate review. Patricia stood up shakily. You can't do this. Richard would never have wanted. Richard is dead, I said bluntly. And this is my company. She gathered her purse and portfolio with trembling hands. At the conference room door, she turned back to face my children. This isn't over, she said, her voice low and venomous. I know things about this family, about this company, that could destroy everything you've built. Patricia, I said calmly, if you attempt to interfere with Morrison Industries in any way, through legal action, media manipulation, or industrial espionage, I will have you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. James Bradley is very good at what he does, and he's already documented enough evidence to put you in prison for a very long time. She left without another word, her heels clicking angrily on the polished floor. When the conference room door closed, behind her, I turned to face my children. They looked like survivors of a natural disaster, shell-shocked, displaced, unsure of what came next. Now, I said, sitting down at the head of the table, let's talk about the future of this company. Mom, Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, we didn't know. About the contracts, about the kickbacks. We thought she was helping. No, you didn't, I said gently. Patricia is very good at manipulation. She's been playing a long game, positioning herself as indispensable while making you all believe I was becoming incompetent. Marcus finally looked up. So, what happens? Now? Are you going to fire us? I studied my eldest son's face, seeing the little boy who used to help me count invoices in the kitchen while his father worked late in the garage. That depends. Are you willing to work for your mother? What do you mean? I mean exactly what, I said. For 20 years, you've been working for what you thought was your father's company. Now you know the truth. You work for me. The question is whether you can accept that. Rebecca leaned forward. Mom, we respect you. Of course we respect you. But you haven't been involved in the day-to-day operations for decades. The industry has changed. The markets have changed. Then you'll teach me, I said simply. Just like I taught your father when we started this company in our garage. Just like I taught you both when you were children helping with paperwork after school. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot where Patricia's Mercedes was pulling away for the last time. Morrison Industries was built on family values, I said without turning around. Hard work, integrity, and taking care of each other. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of those values. Patricia didn't corrupt this company. She just exploited weaknesses that were already there. I turned back to face them. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to learn everything I need to know about how this company operates today. You're going to help me understand what's changed and what needs to be fixed. And together, we're going to rebuild Morrison Industries into something we can all be proud of. And if we can't do that, Marcus asked quietly, then I'll find people who can. The message was clear. This was their chance to prove they could work with me instead of around me. Their chance to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. I need some time to think, Rebecca said finally. So do I, Marcus added. I nodded. Take all the time you need. But while you're thinking, remember this. I've spent 3 years watching my own children treat me like a burden while a stranger stole my life's work. I won't be sidelined again. Not by Patricia. Not by anyone. I gathered my papers and headed for the door. I'll be in the CEO's office if you need me. I assume Patricia hasn't redecorated that yet. The CEO's office on the 4th floor had been Richard's domain for 30 years, and walking into it felt like stepping back in time. Patricia had made changes. The family photos were gone, replaced by generic corporate art, and Richard's old oak desk had been swapped for something sleek and modern. But the bones of the room were the same. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the industrial district, built-in bookshelves lined with construction manuals and industry publications, and a view of the warehouse where it all began. I sat down in the executive chair, my chair now, and immediately called James Bradley. Eleanor, I was hoping to hear from you. How did it go? Better than expected, and worse than I feared, I said, then filled him in on the confrontation with Patricia and the revelation about the unauthorized contracts. Good God, James muttered when I finished. She's been running a sophisticated con game. The kickback scheme alone could result in felony charges. What's our next move? Damage control. We need to identify every contract, agreement, and commitment Patricia made without authorization. We need to notify clients, vendors, and partners that she had no legal authority to act on behalf of Morrison Industries. And we need to determine what financial damage she's caused. How long will that take? With full cooperation from your children. A week. Without it? Months. Through the office window, I could see Marcus and Rebecca standing in the parking lot, deep in conversation. As I watched, David's truck pulled up, and he got out looking confused and concerned. Clearly, one of his siblings had called him. James, I'm going to need to move fast on this. Patricia made threats on her way out, and I suspect she's not going down without a fight. What kind of threats? She said she knows things about the family and the company that could destroy everything. I'm not sure if that's bluster or if she actually has something. Either way, we need to get ahead of it. Eleanor, I'm going to recommend something you might not like. I'm listening. You should consider hiring a crisis management firm. If Patricia decides to go public with whatever she thinks she knows, or if she tries to spin this as elder abuse or family infighting, you need professionals who can control the narrative. Elder abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had been stealing from my company might try to claim I was the one being mistreated. Do it, I said. Hire whoever you think is best. And James? I want a forensic accountant to go through every financial transaction Patricia was involved in for the past 3 years. I want to know exactly how much money we're talking about. After hanging up with James, I spent an hour familiarizing myself with the current state of Morrison Industries. Patricia had been busy, and not just with unauthorized contracts. She'd implemented new procedures, changed vendor relationships, and apparently instituted weekly strategic planning meetings that she led. The woman had essentially been running my company while convincing everyone that I was too old and incompetent to notice. A knock on the door interrupted my review of the quarterly reports. Come in. Marcus entered, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 2 hours. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, apparently unsure how to begin. I owe you an apology, he said finally. Sit down, Marcus. He took the chair across from my desk, the same chair he'd sat in as a teenager when Richard would bring him to work during summer breaks. But this conversation was going to be very different from those long-ago father-son talks about the family business. Mom, I had no idea about the ownership structure. Dad never told us. I asked him. Not to, I said. I thought it would be better for you children to make your own way without feeling like you were working for your mother's charity. Marcus winced. I've been treating you like you were irrelevant. Like you were just Dad's ex-wife who needed to be managed. Yes, you have. He flinched at my bluntness. But I wasn't interested in making this easy for him. We'd moved past the point where hurt feelings could be soothed with gentle words and good intentions. I understand why Patricia was able to manipulate you, I continued. She's very good at what she does. But Marcus, you're 45 years old. You're the vice president of operations for a multi-million-dollar company. At what point did you think to verify her authority? At what point did you question whether a woman who'd been married to your father for less than 3 years should be making major business decisions? I don't know, he said quietly. She was so confident, so knowledgeable. And when she started talking about your age, about the incidents with your memory. What incidents? Marcus looked uncomfortable. Small things? She said you'd been forgetting names, getting confused about dates. She made it sound like you were starting to slip mentally, and that we needed to protect you from making decisions that could hurt you or the company. The manipulation had been even more thorough than I'd realized. Patricia hadn't just positioned herself as the competent alternative. She'd actively undermined my credibility by fabricating evidence of cognitive decline. Marcus, in the past year, have you personally witnessed me forgetting names or getting confused about anything significant? He thought for a moment, then shook his head. No, but Patricia said. Patricia lied. About my mental state, about her authority, about her motives. She's been playing a very sophisticated game, and we all got played. So what happens now? Now we fix the damage she's caused and make sure it never happens again. I leaned forward in my chair. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you want to continue working for Morrison Industries? Of course I do. This company is my life. No, I corrected. This company is my life. It can be part of your life, but only if you understand that you work for me now, not for some idealized version of your father's legacy. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but subdued. What would you need from me? Honesty, Complete transparency about every business decision, every contract, every relationship Patricia was involved in. I need you to help me understand what she changed and what needs to be fixed. And after that, we rebuild. Together, if you're willing to do it right. Separately, if you're not. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm willing, Mom. Whatever it takes. Good. Then your first assignment is to call an all-hands meeting for Monday morning. I want to address every employee. Personally, introduce myself as the new CEO and make it clear that there's been a change in leadership. What should I tell people about Patricia? Tell them the truth. She was never authorized to make decisions on behalf of Morrison Industries, and any commitments she made are under review. After Marcus left, Rebecca appeared in my doorway. She looked pale and shaken, but determined. Mom, can we talk? Of course. Rebecca sat down in the same chair Marcus had just vacated, but her posture was different, less defensive, more vulnerable. I've been going through Patricia's files, she said. The financial irregularities are worse than we thought. How much worse? Rebecca pulled out a tablet and showed me a spreadsheet. In addition to the Davidson Materials kickback, she's been receiving consulting fees from at least 4 other vendors. The total is close to $200,000 over 18 months. $200,000. Patricia had stolen $200,000 from my company while convincing my children that I was the problem. There's more, Rebecca continued. She's been using the company credit card for personal expenses, restaurants, shopping, even what looks like a weekend vacation to Napa Valley. How much? Another $50,000 approximately. I felt a cold anger settle in my chest. This wasn't just business fraud, this was personal theft on a massive scale. Rebecca, I want you to document everything. Every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized payment, every personal expense. We're going to need it for the criminal investigation. Criminal investigation? Patricia stole $250,000 from Morrison Industries. That's grand theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. She's going to prison. Rebecca's eyes widened. Mom, are you sure you want to go that far? I mean, she's family. No, I said firmly. She's not family. She was married to your father for 3 years. I've been part of this company for 37 years. Patricia is a criminal who stole from us, and she's going to face the consequences. What about the publicity? The damage to the company's reputation? It was a fair concern. A public fraud case involving the CEO's widow could generate the kind of negative attention that destroyed companies. James is hiring a crisis management firm, I said. We'll control the narrative. Morrison Industries is the victim here, not the perpetrator. Rebecca nodded, then hesitated. Mom, there's something else. About the Harrington deal. What about it? Patricia wasn't just trying to sell them 30% of the company. She was positioning it as a management buyout. She told them that the current ownership was unstable and that new management was needed. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Patricia hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been planning a complete takeover of Morrison Industries. She was going to sell them enough shares to give them effective control, I said slowly. Yes, and she was positioning herself as the interim CEO who would facilitate the transition. The scope of Patricia's betrayal was breathtaking. She hadn't just been skimming money. She'd been planning to steal the entire company. Rebecca, I need you to contact Harrington Development immediately. Schedule a meeting with their CEO for this week. I want to find out exactly what Patricia told them and what commitments she made. What will you tell them? The truth. That they were negotiating with someone who had no authority to sell what she was offering, and that Morrison Industries is not for sale. By the time David arrived at the office, word had spread through the building that something major was happening. Employees were clustering in small groups, whispering and speculating. Patricia's dramatic departure had been witnessed by several people, and now the arrival of all 3 Morrison children at once was feeding the rumor mill. David knocked on my doorframe. "Mom, Marcus said you wanted to see me." "Come in, sweetheart." Close the door. David was my youngest, my artistic child, the one who'd always been more interested in creating beautiful things than in business operations. But he was also the most emotionally intelligent of my children, the one most likely to see through manipulation and lies. "David, I need to know something. How long have you been aware of Patricia's involvement in company decisions?" He sat down and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd had since childhood when he was stressed or uncertain. "Honestly, it's been gradual. At first, it was just little things. She'd mention conversations she'd had with vendors, or she'd have opinions about marketing strategies. Then she started attending meetings, and people began deferring to her. Did you ever question her authority?" "I tried to, once, when she overruled a creative decision I'd made about a marketing campaign. I asked Marcus about it, and he said, Patricia had been working closely with Dad before he died, learning about the business. He said we should respect her input." Another lie. Richard had been too sick in his final months to work closely with anyone on business matters. "David, I'm going to be very direct with you. Patricia has been committing fraud. She's stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Morrison Industries and was planning to sell the company to outside investors. She had no legal authority to do any of it." David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, and finally, anger. "That bitch," he said quietly. "Language," I said automatically, then smiled. "But yes, that's an accurate assessment. What can I do to help?" And there it was, the difference between David and his siblings. Marcus and Rebecca had asked what was going to happen to them. David asked what he could do to help. "I need you to review every marketing decision Patricia influenced. I want to know what campaigns she changed, what vendors she recommended, what strategies she implemented. If she was getting kickbacks from contractors, she might have been getting them from marketing firms too. I'll start on it immediately." As David left my office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the passive hope that things would work out, but the active hope that comes from taking control of your own destiny. Patricia had spent 3 years systematically stealing my company and isolating me from my family. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated what Eleanor Morrison was capable of when pushed too far, and now she was about to find out. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where I'd confronted Patricia, but everything had changed. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been cleaned and updated with new blinds. The walls displayed photographs of Morrison Industries projects spanning 4 decades, from Richard's first small residential job to our latest commercial development. Most importantly, the people gathered around the table were there by choice, not manipulation. Marcus sat to my right, looking healthier and more confident than he had in years. Rebecca was across from him, pregnancy glowing on her face as she prepared for the birth of what would be Morrison Industries' next generation. David occupied the creative corner, his laptop open to architectural renderings for our expanded headquarters. And at the far end of the table sat Jennifer Walsh, our new chief operating officer, a brilliant woman in her 50s who'd brought 30 years of construction industry experience and zero tolerance for corporate games. The quarterly numbers are in, Rebecca announced, distributing copies of the financial report. Revenue is up 18% from the same period last year, profit margins have improved by 12%, and our client satisfaction scores are the highest they've been in 5 years. I smiled as I reviewed the numbers. Morrison Industries wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The Davidson Materials situation has been fully resolved, Marcus added. We voided their contract based on the fraud investigation, and they've agreed to pay restitution rather than face criminal charges themselves. Our new supplier relationship with Henderson Construction Materials is saving us approximately $40,000 annually. The fraud investigation had been thorough and devastating for Patricia. When everything was tallied, she'd stolen nearly $300,000 from Morrison Industries through kickbacks, fake consulting fees, and personal expenses charged to company accounts. The district attorney had called it one of the most sophisticated corporate fraud schemes they'd prosecuted in years. Patricia had pled guilty to 12 felony counts and was currently serving a 4-year sentence at the Women's Correctional Facility in Riverside County. Her assets had been seized to pay restitution, including the Mercedes she'd driven away from Morrison Industries for the last time. But the most satisfying part of her downfall hadn't been the criminal conviction. It had been watching my children finally see her for what she really was. "What's the status on the Phoenix expansion?" I asked Jennifer. "We're ahead of schedule and under budget," she replied with a smile. "The local contractors have been impressed with our operation, and we've already received inquiries about 3 additional projects in the Arizona market." The Phoenix expansion had been Patricia's idea originally, but she'd been planning to use it as justification for selling part of the company to outside investors. Now, we were funding it ourselves through a combination of retained earnings and a modest bank loan secured by our excellent credit rating. "Excellent. David, how's the marketing campaign performing?" My youngest son grinned. "Better than we projected. The Built by Family, Built to Last theme is resonating strongly with both residential and commercial clients. We're getting calls from people who specifically want to work with Morrison Industries because of our family values and community commitment." Family values. It was ironic that our company was now known for the very thing Patricia had tried to destroy. A knock on the conference room door interrupted our meeting. Sarah, David's wife, peered in with the apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Eleanor, you have visitors downstairs. They said it was important." I glanced at my watch. We weren't expecting anyone, and my assistant usually screened all appointments. "Who is it?" 3 women from the senior living community Patricia had recommended. Sunset Manor, I think? The room went completely silent. Marcus and Rebecca exchanged worried glances, and David actually stood up as if preparing to defend me from some kind of attack. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest. "Really? How interesting. Send them up, please." "Mom," Rebecca said carefully, "what do you think they want?" "I have no idea, but I'm certainly curious to find out." 5 minutes later, 3 well-dressed women in their 60s and 70s were ushered into our conference room. They looked around nervously, clearly intimidated by the corporate setting. "Mrs. Morrison?" The tallest of the 3, a silver-haired woman with intelligent eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Dorothy Chen, the Residence Council Chairwoman at Sunset Manor. These are my colleagues, Margaret Williams and Ruth Peterson." "It's nice to meet you, ladies. Please, have a seat. Can we offer you coffee or water?" "Thank you, we're fine." Dorothy settled into a chair, but her posture remained formal. "Mrs. Morrison, we're here because we owe you an apology." "An apology? That was the last thing I'd expected." "I'm not sure I understand." Margaret Williams, a petite woman with fierce eyes, leaned forward. 6 months ago, a woman named Patricia Whitmore approached our community administrator. She told him she was representing your family and that you were interested in moving to Sunset Manor. My blood pressure spiked, but I kept my expression neutral. "Did she now?" "She painted a very specific picture," Ruth Peterson added, her voice tight with anger. "She said you were showing signs of dementia, that you'd been making poor financial decisions, and that your children were concerned about your safety living alone." The manipulation had been even worse than I'd realized. Patricia hadn't just been undermining me with my own family. She'd been spreading lies throughout the community. She arranged for tours, discussed pricing, and even put down a deposit to hold a unit for you, Dorothy continued. "We were told to expect you to move in within 6 months. And when I didn't appear?" "We started asking questions," Margaret said grimly. "Especially after Mrs. Peterson here recognized your name from a newspaper article about Morrison Industries' expansion." Ruth nodded. "The article mentioned that Eleanor Morrison was the company's founder and majority owner, It didn't sound like someone who was suffering from dementia and making poor financial decisions. So we did some investigating of our own, Dorothy added. We found out about Mrs. Whitmore's arrest and conviction for fraud. We realized she'd been lying to us about everything. The three women looked genuinely distressed, and I felt my anger softening into something closer to sympathy. Ladies, you were victims too, I said gently. Patricia was very good at manipulation. She convinced my own children that I was declining, mentally. But we should have verified her story, Margaret insisted. We should have contacted you directly instead of taking her word for it. We're responsible for protecting our community's reputation, and we failed. That's why we're here, Dorothy said. We want to formally apologize for any distress this may have caused you, and we want to invite you to visit Sunset Manor, not as a potential resident, but as our guest. We'd like you to see what we're really about. I looked around the conference room at my children, who were watching this exchange with fascination and growing smiles. You know what? I said, standing up. I'd like that very much. Not because I need senior living services, but because I suspect you ladies run a much better operation than Patricia gave you credit for. Dorothy's face lit up. We'd be honored to have you visit. And, Mrs. Morrison, if you ever do decide you want a different living situation, you'll know we're here. But it will be your choice, made with full information and no pressure from anyone else. After the three women left, the conference room was quiet for a moment. Then David started chuckling. Patricia tried to put you in a senior home and ended up putting herself in prison instead. There's a certain poetic justice to it, Rebecca agreed. Marcus shook his head in amazement. Mom, I still can't believe how thoroughly she fooled us. She fooled all of us, Marcus. The important thing is that we learned from it. Jennifer, who'd been quietly observing this family dynamic, spoke up. Eleanor, if you don't mind me saying so, this family's ability to recover from crisis and come out stronger is remarkable. It's exactly the kind of leadership that makes companies thrive long-term. Thank you, Jennifer. But I want to be clear about something. I looked around the table at each person there. Morrison Industries is stronger now not because we survived Patricia's betrayal, but because we finally started being honest with each other. It was true. The months following Patricia's arrest had been difficult, but they'd also been healing. Marcus, Rebecca, and David had all gone through their own reckonings with how they'd treated me, and we'd had conversations that were long overdue. More importantly, they'd stepped up in ways that surprised even me. Marcus had thrown himself into learning every aspect of the business, not just the operational side he'd managed before. Rebecca had streamlined our financial systems and implemented new controls to prevent future fraud. And David had expanded his role beyond marketing to include customer relations and community outreach. Speaking of honesty, I said, there's something I want to discuss with all of you. I stood up and walked to the windows, looking out over the warehouse district where Morrison Industries had its roots. I'm 70 years old. I have no intention of retiring anytime soon, but I do want to start planning for the future of this company. The room went very quiet. Over the next 5 years, I want to gradually transition more operational control to the three of you. Not because I'm incompetent or declining, but because it's the right thing to do for Morrison Industries. I turned back to face them. But this transition will happen on my terms, at my pace, and with my full involvement in every decision. No more assumptions about what's best for me. No more decisions made behind my back. And absolutely no more outside interference from people who don't have this family's best interests at heart. Marcus raised his hand like a schoolchild, and I couldn't help but smile. Yes, Marcus? Does this mean you'll consider that Italy trip again? I laughed, remembering how that conversation at my birthday lunch had been one of the first signs of Patricia's manipulation. As a matter of fact, I've already booked it. Jennifer will be handling operations while I'm gone for 3 weeks in October. 3 weeks? Rebecca's eyes widened. Mom, that's quite a trip for someone your age. She caught herself and blushed. I mean, that sounds like a wonderful adventure. It does sound wonderful, I agreed. And when I get back, I'll have stories to tell and energy to invest in Morrison Industries' continued growth. The meeting concluded with assignments for everyone and a sense of purpose that had been missing from our family business for far too long. As people filed out, David lingered behind. Mom, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Are you happy? I mean, really happy? Because for a while there, especially around your birthday, you seemed so sad. I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I'd felt invisible, discounted, and increasingly isolated from my own family. I'd been watching my life's work be stolen while being told I was too old and incompetent to understand what was happening. Now I was the CEO of a thriving company, working alongside children who respected and valued my contributions, and planning the European adventure I'd been dreaming about for 30 years. David, I'm happier than I've been in years. Not because I got revenge on Patricia. That was just justice. I'm happy because I remembered who I am. Who are you? He asked with a smile. I'm Eleanor Morrison. I built a company, raised 3 wonderful children, survived betrayal and manipulation, and at 70 years old, I'm still writing my own story. 2 days later, I received an unexpected phone call. Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Sarah Williams with the District Attorney's Office. I worked on the Patricia Whitmore case. Yes, Detective. How can I help you? We've had an interesting development. Mrs. Whitmore's attorney has contacted us about a possible appeal. She's claiming that she was acting under duress from an abusive family situation and that her actions were motivated by fear. I felt my blood pressure spike. Even from prison, Patricia was still trying to manipulate the situation. Detective, what does that mean for the case? Probably nothing. Her conviction was based on solid evidence, and her claims about family abuse are contradicted by the fact that she was systematically stealing from you and your children. But I wanted to give you a heads up in case she or her attorney tries to contact you directly. Thank you for the warning. Mrs. Morrison, if I may say so, you handled this situation with remarkable grace. A lot of people in your position would have been consumed by anger and revenge. Instead, you focused on rebuilding and moving forward. After hanging up, I sat in my office for a few minutes, thinking about Patricia's latest manipulation attempt. Even facing the consequences of her actions, she couldn't accept responsibility. She had to find someone else to blame, some way to position herself as the victim, but her lies no longer had power over me. I picked up my phone and called my travel agent. Hi, Maria. It's Eleanor Morrison. I wanted to add something to my Italy itinerary. Of course. What would you like to add? I'd like to extend my stay by a week. I want to take a cooking class in Tuscany. That sounds wonderful. Any particular type of cooking? I smiled, thinking about all the birthday dinners and family celebrations I'd missed while Patricia was systematically erasing me from my own family. Something traditional. Something I can make for my family when I get home. Because that's what Eleanor Morrison did. She learned new things, created beautiful experiences, and brought people together around the table. At 70 years old, she was just getting started. Epilogue. 1 year later, the sign outside Morrison Industries had been updated. Morrison Industries, family-owned, since 1982, family-led since 2024. It was a small change, but it reflected a fundamental shift in how we operated. Marcus had been promoted to Executive Vice President. Rebecca was now Chief Financial Officer with expanded responsibilities. And David had become Director of Creative Services and Community Relations. Jennifer Walsh continued as Chief Operating Officer, providing the steady hand of an experienced professional who wasn't caught up in family dynamics. And I remained CEO, actively involved in every major decision, but no longer carrying the entire burden alone. The Italy trip had been everything I'd dreamed it would be. I'd walked through Roman ruins, sailed along the Amalfi Coast, and yes, learned to make authentic Italian pasta in a farmhouse kitchen in Tuscany. The photos from that trip now decorated the reception area at Morrison Industries, and employees often stopped to ask about my adventures. Patricia had lost her appeal and was serving the remainder of her sentence. We'd heard through legal channels that she was planning to move to another state when she was released, which was fine with all of us. But the most important change was smaller and harder to quantify. My children called regularly now, not because they needed something, but because they wanted to talk. They asked my opinion on business decisions not out of obligation, but because they valued my experience. And when we gathered for family dinners, I was no longer a polite guest at my own. Toast! On my 71st birthday, we had a small celebration at the office. No formal restaurant, no performative speeches, just cake in the conference room and genuine conversation with people who knew and appreciated exactly who Eleanor Morrison was. Marcus presented me with a plaque that now hangs on my office wall. To Eleanor Morrison, founder, CEO, and matriarch of Morrison Industries. Thank you for showing us that it's never too late to reclaim your power. As I looked around that conference room at my children, my colleagues, and the company we'd built together, I realized that Patricia had actually done me a favor. Her betrayal had forced me to stop being passive, to stop accepting other people's definitions of who I was and what I was capable of. At 71, Eleanor Morrison wasn't slowing down. She was just getting warmed up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.